Various discussions have been held as to whether it was just Miss Patchett living in the house and whether the school was actually a side in the old warehouse. Here we see both of them really the wrong way around. The house end on and that old warehouse near the main road. And this was built by Jack Sharp, this house and the warehouse alongside. And I shall refer to him in the second half. So the discussions that have gone on was, did the staff live in the big house with Miss Patchett? Were there 2 or 3 staff who lived there? And the girls were lodged in the old warehouse and taught there? The answer is we're not absolutely sure, but that does seem fairly likely. I'm not absolutely sure how well maps work on a screen, especially if you're a long way away from me. But this is from an old Ordnance Survey map of Southowram in the late 19th century. The top left-hand corner, you can see Banktop, the area through which you approach Southowram. If you've come up Southowram Bank or along Beacon Hill Road in that direction, coming down past the Cock and Bottle Hotel, as they called it, through what were often little fields in those days, all filled with houses at the turn or just after the 20th century. And you come round a bend and a double bend, and then there's Law Hill on that bend there. And the shape hasn't changed very much today. I've put to the right a little arrow, and that arrow says towards Walter Clough. Why I'm highlighting Walter Clough will be, I hope it will become apparent in due course. So Emily was staying for about 6 months in 1838-39 and working at Law Hill, probably staying in the house and teaching in what had been the woolen warehouse. I'm going to now introduce you to 3 houses, one of which is, of course, Law Hill. No, it's 4 houses actually. Law Hill, pointed out in blue, that's its location. Walter Clough Hall, as I said, up that little lane, not very far away to the right. More about that in due course. I think nearly all of you will know where Shibden Hall is. You probably know it better than the other houses by far. And right up at the top, outside Southowram, just in Northowram Old Township, high above Hawley Green and Godley Cutting, was this High Sunderland Hall. So these are denoted locations which I shall be referring to, some more than others during the evening. This is the 1841 census return for Law Hill House and School. By this time, Emily had already gone for about 2 years, but we can see Elizabeth Patchett's name if we look very closely, and we can also see the names of 2 other teachers, one of whom was almost certainly Emily Bronte's replacement after she left, and below them a long, long list of girls and their ages and so on. Emily Bronte's first biographer was a lady called Mary Robinson. There have been quite a few of those, but it's very helpful that she had a much more unusual name by marriage. She became Madame du Clos. So she ended up with a French name. And she was the earliest biographer, and her work first appeared in 1883. That is quite a long time after the publication back in 1847 of Wuthering Heights. Strange in a way that nobody got around to sorting this out. Not going to go into all the details about Wuthering Heights. We know it was phenomenally popular, it continues to be phenomenally popular, and it's a wonderful gift to the world, telling people about the Yorkshire moors and other things. So Madame du Clos, or Mary Robinson, in her book, her biography, highlighted how the whole area around where Emily was living at any given time had affected her. So this included, of course, the moors above Haworth, but also considered other aspects where Emily had lived in other parts. Now we come to High Sunderland, and as we have an extraordinary generous offer of having a scale model which is, as far as I can tell, remarkably accurate, I don't hardly need to show you these pictures on the screen, but I'll try and do so all the same. A lovely old castellated house, which stood, as I said, high above the Godley Cutting, above Hawley Green, high above the Shibden Valley. So this looks a bit like a fortress, doesn't it, with battlements on the top. It didn't start off like that at all, but more about that in a moment. Many people will tell you that Wuthering Heights was inspired partly or solely by Top Withens above on the moors above Haworth. Others will say elements of it were inspired by Pondon Hall on the road across the Pennines. And I've been to see both. I mean, it's very difficult for me as an amateur to say anything about what I feel. But people have opinions, and we're all entitled to our opinions. And I think the location of Top Withens is very likely to be what was in Emily's mind when she wrote Wuthering Heights. But there is this other candidate. And the first person who seems to have come up with the idea that Wuthering Heights might have been inspired by this castellated building above Halifax was a chap called the Reverend Thomas Keyworth. And he was a Congregationalist minister at Harrison Road Chapel in Halifax. It's more lately been called Carlton United Reformed Church, and it's almost at an oblique angle to the Literary and Philosophical Society's rooms that we saw a picture of just now. And he came up with the idea that if he did some studies of the area around Halifax, near where Emily had lived in 1838-39, he would see if any of them could correlate with things that Emily had written. Now, Thomas Keyworth was himself a founder member of the Brontë Society, so he was a man who knew quite a bit about the Brontes, and he associated with many others in the 1890s and afterwards. If we move forward in time and come down to the early 20th century, one of my predecessors as president of Halifax Antiquarian Society was a chap called Thomas William Hanson. He lived for 90 years and died in 1967. He carried out an enormous amount of research into houses and people in this area. Wrote a lot of papers for the Antiquarian Society, and he read a lot about the Brontes, and he wrote about them for the Brontë Society. And he supported the claim made a little earlier by Keyworth that there were elements of the house up at High Sunderland, which was then still standing, which indicated influence that Emily might have seen in her lifetime. And this is a frontispiece of Horner's buildings in the town and parish of Halifax, 1835. This was, of course, before Emily would have known that area, shortly before. Horner was a very famous painter and engraver in that era. If we come forward to 1957, in the Brontë Society transactions for that year, a lady called Hilda Marsden, who was remarkably knowledgeable about the Brontes and who also studied the topography of the moors around here and around Haworth, came up with the idea that yes, these two earlier gentlemen had been right, and that there was more evidence to suggest than looking at the exterior of the building, which might have inspired Emily's Wuthering Heights. She thought that some of the layout inside the building, as described in the novel, helped support this theory. And also other landmarks around Halifax are mentioned too. As I said, we don't need perhaps all these plans and things tonight, as we have a novel over there for you to look at in due course. This is a rough plan of High Sunderland, but this is as it was in the early 20th century. It was built originally as a half-timbered hall, rather like Shibden, with two side arms, two side gables if you like, and it had a central house body running across the middle. This was altered greatly, so when it was built, we believe it was built way back in the 1400s originally, and later on it was extensively altered and covered in stone. So if we look at Emily's first visit to Wuthering Heights, we are told, remember Lockwood, Mr. Lockwood going up to that door and considering various aspects as he looked up at the house, and he commented on various inscriptions carved on the walls. He talks about dates, and he also talks about some very curious figures dotted around and a big gateway. The two figures which he refers to rather, they were boys without any clothes on, that's how he described them, and certainly High Sunderland had two figures like that above its gateway. We'll have a look at in due course again at that. So this was the start of when Mr. Lockwood, who's a tenant of course of Heathcliff, goes up in the early 1800s, sees this house on the moor, meets Heathcliff. Before he goes in, this is what he's aware of. And he goes in and he describes a certain amount of the interior, and we get more about that as the book moves on. So High Sunderland, if we look at the red circle there, it's on a sort of plateau on the edge of Northowram, the edge of Southowram, and the large picture on the right, the road's in the top right-hand corner, that is Stump Cross. I hope that helps the perspective a little bit. The Godley cutting comes out of sight to the right, so it's really high up there, almost on the edge of the moors, as it would have been going back many centuries. We also see a closer overhead view and an engraving of the early 20th century, again by Arthur Comfort. And we come back then to that illustration at the frontispiece of Horner's volume in 1835. And one of the descriptions in Mr. Lockwood's early visit to Wuthering Heights is that it had a lot of jutting stones. Well, some of those stones in that gateway and around there could agree with that description. And as well as there being various figures above the house itself, we see that there's even a giant kind of to the left above this gateway. I don't think that Mr. Whiteley has quite managed to reproduce these, but who can blame him? They'd be too complicated in that sort of dimension. But this is Horner's vision again. So two gateways there, and they're very splendid gateways, as you can see, one each side there. We have in fact the same gateway both sides, but in the centre we have the main doorway, and going into there was a long porch which presumably led through to what had once been the middle section, the house body, as you might say we have at Shibden Hall today. And we have these two figures of naked men high up above the door, which correlate beautifully with the description of Mr. Lockwood in Wuthering Heights. And here again we see a section above the doorway, the gateway, and both engraved and photographed. There again, that's a bit clearer, the figures above the main doorway. And Mr. Lockwood described the fact that the doors and the windows were set deeply in the wall. Well, some of them are, some of them were, I should say, and certainly the main doorway was. And it would originally have gone through, as I said, to the house body. Various alterations were made to this house over many centuries. It was encased in stone by the Sunderland family, who we know lived on that site as far back as the 1270s. So if your name is Sunderland, or you have that surname in your family, it may well be the area from which your family originated or connected with. So there was this half-timbered building encased in stone in the 1620s by a Richard Sunderland, and here we see a rather nice painting of it from the late 19th century, when the area around it was farmed. It was farmed by the Halifax Industrial Society, which was the forerunner of the Halifax Co-op. And today it's quite a bleak place, and you think, don't do much farming up here these days, and of course the house has gone too. But in those days they made quite a good living at cultivating the area around the house. So we come back to the 1835 engraving of High Sunderland. We see there cows, and we see a sort of garden area enclosed. Again, plans are not perhaps the best to look at, but if we see this plan, which comes from Edward Chitham's 1987 Life of Emily Brontë, we have an area, the shape of the hall to the left, and the bottom, below that to the left, the barn, which was probably not built till nearly 1800. But the house looking outwards And you can see that overhead view there with the, I hope you can get some impression from the shape in the map and the fact that we have the building which has been sort of tilted round for the overhead view. The church up at Southowram that we know today, St Anne, where we think that, well, we certainly know that Miss Patchett worshipped and probably took her girls and Emily along with her, was the successor of an old chapel of St Anne which was further down the hill in the direction of Brighouse. Some of you may have heard of this building down there. This is an image of a structure which was demolished later in the 19th century, but if Emily had wandered down that way, she'd have found what had been the old chapel, and suggestions have been made by Brontë enthusiasts that this could be the inspiration for Gimmerton Chapel in Wuthering Heights. I don't know at all. Anyway, comparative locations then, High Sunderland and Shibden Hall. Why am I mentioning this? Well, it's because of a theory that, as well as High Sunderland having inspired Emily as to certain aspects of the exterior of Wuthering Heights for her novel, also used Shibden Hall to represent something else, another house in her novel. And that, of course, was Thrushcross Grange. It's one of those things, the location isn't quite right if you compare the distance between buildings in the novel Wuthering Heights, and the description isn't quite right. It could have been that Emily was inspired a little by it, much more likely somewhere over near Haworth. Of course, at that time, 1838-39, Anne Lister was living there, and lots of descriptions have been, well, lots of fantasies have been thought up. Did they actually meet one another? Well, they were in various different states of life, statuses we might say. One was the daughter of an impoverished clergyman, really, and of course Miss Lister at Shibden Hall was a little bit more wealthy, so perhaps not very likely. And of course, for quite a bit of the time when Emily was teaching up at Southowram in 1838-39, Anne Lister and Anne Walker were out of the country, so probably not very likely. So here we are, we come now to the interval, and this is a lovely sketch I discovered online. It's in the Tate Gallery. It's Lady Edna Clark Hall's image of Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights. Well, if you can make out that that's the inside of a building near Halifax or a building near Haworth, you're much cleverer than I am. Thank you very much.